So analytic thoughts include problem solving. Uh, Now, the takeaway from this part of construction integration model is that we want to engage students in active, effortful, analytical thinking when we are developing a test of reading comprehension. We don't just want to, engage them in some kind of passive, automatic sort of perception. That doesn't count as deep comprehension. So let's keep this in mind: active, effortful, analytical thinking, and move on to a quotation from Kinch. And I think this is very helpful for all of us because it probably just wraps up everything that I have told before quite elegantly. So Kinch proposes that in instruction, and I've also included assessments, it doesn't really matter, it's usually the situation model that the student forms from reading a text that is of interest. The teacher does not care whether the student can recite the text, that's the memory of students, but whether the student understood it correctly and for future use was able to integrate the textual information with whatever background knowledge there was. I think it very eloquently describes everything that I have mentioned earlier. Now, our project basically, in our project, we basically adopted this model. Um, the project aimed to develop a diagnostic system, as I mentioned before, a computerized or online diagnostic system. And this system was basically originally named Cognitive Diagnostic Assessment System. And I think I need to stop here for a little while and provide some information about cognitive diagnostic assessment. Not too much really at the interest of time. So cognitive diagnostic models are kind of advanced, sophisticated psychometric or statistical models, which in one word, or put simply, allow you to break down the ability of, for example, of reading or listening into several components or several sub-skills, if you will, and then provide information of mastery versus non-mastery to every student. For example, you can tell your student whether they have mastered subskill A versus subskill B and subskill C. So that sounds very cool because for a long time there has been this claim that cognitive diagnostic assessment actually conflates psychology and psychometrics. That's really cool. That's what we wanted, because you need to develop a Q metric, a Q metrics, and then define the relationship between items and subskills and so on and so forth. So we started off trying to develop a cognitive diagnostic system. And we also had a plan B just in case that multidimensional representation of language would fail. What are you going to do? Well, our plan B was simply to use a Roche model, one of the few models in the family of Roche measurement. We realized that CDM, or cognitive diagnostic model, didn't work for us for a variety of reasons. Number one was we would have difficulty conveying that information to students, and that was the most important thing. Apart from the technicalities, I think we wouldn't have issues with technicalities of the analysis, but then we were thinking about our main stakeholders. That was the group of students who were going to take the test. How would we, explain that they had the meaning of you have mastered the ability to understand surface information, or the ability to make inferences? You have mastered it, you haven't mastered it. And honestly, it's not very straightforward and very clear cut. So we decided we would go with a simpler way of doing things. In consultation with teachers from schools, we thought the technical model that the analytical model we were going to use was the Roche measurement. Now, that's just a background about the cognitive diagnostic assessment system. So it actually became basically a diagnostic assessment system online. But I still like the acronym CODIAS. It reads cool, and I still like that. Now, this system is quite extensive. If you think about the scope of the project, looking back in retrospect, I see, gosh, we have done a lot of work in this project. because we developed a pretest followed by individualized different treatments for differentiated learning and feedback associated with each of those treatments, followed by a post-test. And we really spent a lot of time in it. It needed a lot of investment, but ultimately it turned out to be a successful project. What I'm going to do in this webinar is just to zoom in onto the pretest and the kind of feedback that we actually developed, because it's really extensive and we would need a lot of time. So if you want to talk about the whole project, I think that will take quite a few webinars. So let's zoom in onto the pretest and see what kind of test we developed and how useful it was and what kind of issues we encountered, because it was an online system. Okay, first of all, participants. We had a relatively large group of participants, depending on how you interpret the word large. Our sample included 359 secondary 2 and secondary 3 students from Singapore. And the first language of these guys who took the test is actually English. They speak a very good English, wonderful writing skills, wonderful reading and listening skills. It's great. So it's not really, it's different from the context of ESL or EFL kind of assessment. And that's another challenge that we encountered here, because most of the literature in language assessment revolves around the idea of ESL and EFL testing, whereas the context where I'm, researching and teaching and living actually is not an EFL or ESL context. So we first piloted the first version of the test to around 70 students, 68 to be more precise, students. And then we learned a few things, including the fact that we were probably quite ambitious in our first attempt, because the first test included four texts. They were pretty long, so we decided to do away with one of the texts, the last one, because the students didn't find time to answer the questions. So after tweaking and sharpening our assessment following this piloting stage, which I always also recommend that we should include one piloting stage in our assessments, we moved to the main study. It included 2 sessions, actually took 2 full days. During the first day, 117 students from secondary 2 and 3 took the test. On the second day, session 2, 167 students took the test. Now, procedures is actually, there is a little bit of details in procedures, but I have chosen these. I think they are most pertinent to the current webinar. We had a lot of meetings, actually, starting from grant writing all the way to designing the test and administering the test to test takers, and especially speaking with and collaborating with 2 online service providers. There were 2 companies that provide computer technologies to educational systems, educational projects. So we had quite a lot of meetings. That's one of the things that we should consider if we want to do this kind of project in the future. We must be prepared mentally for a lot of meetings. Through these meetings, then we've also talked about the sort of text we wanted to measure, and the text that we wanted to give to the students, based on which we wanted to measure the ability of the test takers. So we used some texts, actually quite a lot of texts, in some workshops with 3 wonderful teachers who helped us choose the most appropriate texts and create test items for the students. So just to give you an idea about the extensiveness of the corpus that we had created, with the help of a research assistant, we chose, it took quite a little bit of time, but we chose 1,000 texts which were potentially useful or pertinent to the level of secondary 2 and 3 students in Singapore. Then we narrowed it down through some cometrics analysis and linguistic analysis and the linguistic and complexity analysis of the texts. We also took into consideration the type of text, especially the genre, because we knew that in Singapore, a variety of texts are read by students, so we had to take that into consideration. This brings me to the previous point of the differentiation between the construct and the theory, because here we were trying to formulate our construct when we needed to take into consideration the realities of the ground and what kind of text students should read and what kind of text would be more useful for our main stakeholders, who are the test takers in the project. So we chose a large number of texts, 3 of which went into our pretest, and quite a large number of them became the treatments, and three more became the post-test. The kind of items that we developed for all of the treatments in pre and post test were actually either multiple choice questions or drag and drop. Multiple choice questions because there is some research that shows that MCQs are typically easier. That means that there is not a huge test effect factor when it comes to multiple choice questions. But we didn't want to make things complicated by including, for example, open-ended questions where students had to write a paragraph or even a sentence. Even though we were using, some computer-based technologies, I think it would have been quite difficult and challenging for us to develop an algorithm to read students' answers and, score them. So it would fall into the realm of writing. I think that's something that Atay is going to talk about later. So what else did we do? Like I said, we used cometrics analysis in order to look into the linguistic features, but we didn't put all the eggs into the basket of cometrics and linguistic features of the passages. We got a lot of wonderful ideas from the teachers who would tell us, for example, this kind of text might not be very much accessible or engaging for the students because of this and that reason. They were very experienced, and their experience helped us a lot. So there are different cometrics applications available. This is the text usability assessor, which I recommend to teachers always. It provides you with 5 indices like syntactic simplicity, narrativity, deep cohesion, and so on. And it's very easy to make sense of. You can use this for your usual teaching as well. And that's the website of Cometrics. And here is the actual Cometrics itself. And we also benefited from this book written by Danielle McNamara and her team. So following all these, one of the outputs of the previous processes was the generation of the pretest. The pretest included 3 texts, as you see, 3 passages. You can see the titles on the left-hand side, the positives and negatives of using social networking sites. The second one was poverty, poaching, and death. And the third one was deep intellect. They're really engaging. I personally loved when I read them, and it was not just my personal idea. Later on, we the data that we collected from students also showed that they also had liked the text, especially deep intellect. It's a very cool text about an octopus living in an aquarium. I think everyone who reads it would enjoy reading it. So we created 2 items for the first passage, 8 items, both multiple choice and drag and drop for the second one, and 5 items for deep intellect. As you see, the subject matter is quite diverse. The first one focuses on social media. The second one is poverty and society. It's a social problem. And the last one is about biology and animals in the form of a story. So it's like an eclectic kind of genre. The length increases as you go from the first text to the second one and the third one, and so does the deep cohesion on the last column, which is pretty high for the first one, which probably helps students to read the text easily and to relate to it, to understand it and comprehend it easily. The second one has a lower deep cohesion, and the third one is even the lowest. Now, so in our theoretical framework, we assume that the first text would be the easiest one, the second one would be the second most difficult, and the last one would be the last most difficult text. That was what we assumed, but then it turned out not to be true, because then we did many facets Rasch measurement on the data. We included 3 facets. I don't want to go through these technicalities, just want to give you an idea here that this is how the many facets Rasch measurement is specified and formulated. So we had 3 facets, and what are they? I think I can show you better here. The first facet from the left-hand side, just after the measure, is students. It's facet 1. As you can see, there are a lot of asterisks and dots. Every asterisk represents 3 people. Every dot represents one student. As you see, there is a normal distribution in the form of a bell curve, more or less, which means that students were normal distributed. That was good news for us, the first good observation. But still, we didn't have any idea if the students if this normal distribution meant that students were significantly different in terms of their ability or not. So I'll provide evidence that they were. Now, section 2, or the second facet, is actually the text that I mentioned before. As you see, our expectations didn't come true exactly, because text 2 was the most difficult one. Text 1 was the second difficult, and text 3 was the easiest one in terms of their difficulty, which is fine. I mean, it didn't really ruin our assessment. It was just a hypothesis that we had, but it didn't work out for us. But another interesting thing was that items, as you see on the 4th or 3rd column there, after just adjacent to section, had also a range, with item 10 on top of the hierarchy, which was the most difficult one, which was not surprising because it was supposedly in one of the more difficult texts. And item 11 was the easiest one, but this was a bit surprising because there were 2 adjacent test items, and this one turned out to be quite difficult. But we didn't quite easy. But we didn't have any hypotheses about the difficulty of items, because my own previous research shows that it's very, very difficult, almost impossible to be able to predict the difficulty level of items. As Gary Bach put it, we always have a theoretical or hypothetical assumption about what makes an item difficult, but in reality, there are a lot of other things that we're ignorant about, and those things we're ignorant about can also affect the difficulty of the items and give you sometimes a completely different profile of item difficulty, as you can see here. Now, I would like to share more information here just to give you an idea how the psychometric functionality of the items looked like. This is a part of the output of many facets Rasch measurement software, FACET, by Dr. Mike Lineker. And those 2 items that I have highlighted are the most difficult and the easiest one that I just mentioned before. So if you look at the 2 last column on the right-hand side, infit mean square and outfit mean square, they provide us with an indication of the functionality of the items. For this kind of assessment, since our questions were like multiple choice questions, something between 0.3 and 1.7, or if you have high stakes tests, something between 0.8 and 1.2 would indicate that your test items are functioning properly. I think almost every item satisfies that expectations pretty well. So we had very good indication here that the items were most likely measuring what they were supposed to be measuring, and that's what traditionally is known as construct validity. So I'm not going to go into the idea of construct validity and all that because I think that will just be a topic for another presentation. Now, for Rasch measurement reliability, I would like to present these pieces of evidence here that clearly show that test takers were different. If you look at the suppression index, that's 2.47. What that means is there were at least 2 levels of ability detected in the test takers. So this is an indication of the discrimination power of the test, which every test developer actually desires to have. In other words, we would like to have at least 2 or more than 2 levels of different differentiation between the test takers, and that's very obvious by very evident by the high rush reliability of 0.86 and separation of 2.47. In the same way, the passages were also different from one another. There were at least 2 levels of separation. And finally, the test items were absolutely different from one another. That's also good because it shows that there was a range in the difficulty, and probably that also indicates that there was a range in the cognitive processes, the difficulty of the cognitive processes that they were measuring. Now, we also wanted to find out how students felt about this assessment system. So we developed a questionnaire. So every student who took the test was also requested to fill in the questionnaire, and we had a return rate of a good return. I don't exactly remember the rate. I'm sorry. It is just I seem to have forgotten it. But the internal consistency index was good, 0.919. That's Cronbach's alpha. And then we ran a regression analysis in which we wanted to figure out if students' perception, as measured by the questionnaire, would predict their reading score. So we found out that yes, test score, the test takers' overall perception of the usefulness of the test significantly predicted their reading scores. What does this mean? As you see, the R square is almost 0.23, which is pretty good for this. Now, this means that this can be interpreted in different ways. One way is that if you have a positive perception about the test that you were taking, your chances of answering the questions better or scoring highly on the test is higher, at least by around 30%. Sorry, by around about 47%, because the beta value is 0.479. So that's really high, which means your attitude is very important. This probably also indicates that some of the students who didn't perform well on the test, it was not just because of their ability in reading. It was might have been that because they didn't like the test, or they didn't even like to attempt the test. That's also a possibility. But I should also ask that add that the students had and their parents had consented to participate in the study, so everything was voluntary. And then actually, in one of the sessions in which I personally was present, I saw that 1 or 2 students left because, well, they didn't like to continue to take the test, which is fine. But overall, this shows to us that if you want to administer a test to students for low stakes or mid stakes purposes, their attitude and the perception, the positivity of their perception can have an impact on their performance as well. Meaning that the test score is not a pure representation of their test performance. There are other factors coming from their affective schemata that can influence their performance. And one last thing that I would like to share with you, some of the conclusions and some of the lessons that we learned. I think this would be helpful. That developing diagnostic systems, to be honest, is challenging. You know, I have chaired quite a few committees of test development. I have had quite a little bit of experience in test development, but this was the first experience in developing a diagnostic assessment for non-tertiary students. It was quite a challenge, but in the end, it was very rewarding because we learned a lot from this project. So some of the things that I'd suggest is, and they might not be very new to you, is that we need to think very carefully about the uses of the system, because the system, if I think especially if you want to develop an online system, needs to go through maintenance. You need to work with computer technicians. You probably have to work with some companies that provide you with service, some service providers. Like I said before, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but we worked with 2 companies. I probably didn't mention this. We worked with 2 companies. One of them was a local company based in Singapore. And the first company we started working with was in the US. The service they provided was excellent, but I think the distance and the time differences between Singapore and the US was quite a big factor there. This is something that we hadn't thought about previously, and because I was the principal investigator of this research, I had thought that it wouldn't be a problem because we know the theory, we know how to develop items, we have teachers, and we have this and that. But when it comes to the actual development of the test, those practicality questions become extremely important. And yes, so we work with those guys under those limitations and constraints. They helped us a lot, but then for the administration time, because we wanted to go to schools early in the morning, and there was a 13-hour difference between us and them in Singapore, in the US. So yeah, you can imagine that we had quite a lot of issues. Sometimes the system wouldn't work, and we would just need someone like a backup person to go through the system and resolve the problem, but we didn't have that. So we decided to move on to the Singaporean that's the local service provider. It was much better, to be honest, because they would send their staff with us to the school, and they would go through the computers. They were familiar with the computer system of the school, and a lot of other factors that together convinced us that it would be better, at least for us, to work with a local service provider rather than a wonderful service provider who has a lot of reputation but is not physically present in our context. Now, online, more about this, online assessments also need security. Of course, in our context, luckily, security was not a big issue because students would do the tests in the computer labs. So that wasn't a big issue. But if you want to use online assessment systems, and this is not something new, we all know that, one of the first things that we need to take into consideration is the security, especially if it's a high stakes test. Then security is absolutely important. I think all of us have heard, or most of us have heard about the problem that some of the universities, especially in English-speaking countries, have encountered recently due to the global pandemic. The number of overseas students applying to those universities has dwindled, primarily because most of those people, those students who apply, are from non-English speaking countries, and in order to gain entry to the university, they have to show that they meet the requirements of English proficiency. But again, because of this global pandemic, all of the assessment systems, assessment companies around the world seem to have closed down their testing centers. So what those universities are doing now, because that's an important source of revenue generation anyway. What those universities are doing is to start to accept some tests which are probably not secure. For example, some students can just download an app on their phones or their computers and take some simple test items and get a certificate for their English proficiency. Whereas those scores, to my understanding, I'm not going to mention any of these apps and stuff really, but I have done a little bit of background search, and I think that most of these test scores have not been validated for the purposes that they are being put to. So security being an issue because you wouldn't know who has really taken the test. Is it the student, or the student plus someone else who's giving help to him or her, or some totally different person who took the test for that person? Security is important, definitely. Like I said, we need to have equipment and facilities. Luckily, in our context, Singapore, every secondary school has a well-equipped computer lab. And I think I recently heard that Singapore's government is giving away one laptop to every student, pre-tertiary student. So it doesn't seem to be really much of a big issue here in a context like Singapore. But if you're developing such a system outside of Singapore, we also need to think about students' access to computers and secure computers. two more point is students' eagerness and positive attitude to participate in that study is also important, as my evidence of perception showed before. And finally, we definitely need good collaborations between teachers and researchers. That means that if you are developing a test for students in secondary school or primary school, it's a very good idea to collaborate with a few teachers who know the context of the schools. Thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge a few names here. My colleague, Dr. Chini Lo, Professor Guang Wei Hu from Hong Kong Polytechnic, Christopher Ward, from Ellis of MOE of Singapore, Greendale Secondary School, and Yuhua Secondary School in Singapore. I'm very thankful to the students, to the parents who allowed the students to participate, and to the teaching staff and the principals of the schools. Appreciate their participation. And finally, to the fund provider, Ministry of Education, Academic Funding, MAF for short, which was administered through OER, or Office of Educational Research of our university, and also Dr. Abbas for the invitation. That brings me to the end of this presentation. I think I took quite a little bit of time. I don't know if you have time for discussion now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion, Dr. Wahid. Okay, I would now like to introduce you to the second speaker for today, which is Associate Professor Dr. Atta Gibril. Atta Gibril is Associate Professor and Director of the TESOL program in the Department of Applied Linguistics at the American University in Cairo. His research interests include writing assessment, reading writing connections, assessment literacy, and test validation. He serves on the editorial boards of Journal of Language Testing, Language Assessment Quarterly, Assessing Writing, and TESOL Journal. Dr. Atta has been a keynote speaker in various conferences globally, and Malaysia is not new to him, as he has been here on many occasions. Let us welcome Dr. Atta. Dr. Atta, the screen is all yours.
Okay. Thank you all very much for your kind first upload the file. Okay, here you go. I think you can see the slide now, right?
Yes.
Well, thank you again, Ella, for your kind words and for the invitation. I'm really happy to be talking to you today and with a wonderful group of colleagues at USM. And it's also good to see Wahid finally, as he kindly indicated. We've worked on a couple of projects, but it's the first time actually to meet in person. And I'll try to get right away into my presentation. And as you see on the slide, the talk today is entitled Online Feedback, Student-Centered Approach. And I feel like this topic is timely and much needed given the current COVID-19 situation. And again, what the webinar calls it, the new normal. And I'll try today to touch on some of the issues we encounter usually when we give feedback online to our students. And I'll try to also provide a number of guidelines for teachers who are interested or working with online feedback. And before doing this, let me start with some positive signs. I think in a time of crisis, we tend to come together and collaborate. I'm not saying that teachers don't usually collaborate, but I feel like, you know, there is kind of increasing collaboration among teachers on a number of fronts. If we think about, you know, teachers currently supporting each other, learning new stuff, learning new skills, giving some tips, providing or sharing their own experiences. I think this is really encouraging for us. And I feel also, given what we're currently working on at my university, and also in public and private schools in Cairo, I would argue that there is a better kind of relationship between teachers and both students and parents on a number of ways, because I feel like there is that sympathy going on uh, given the crisis, and teachers try to check on students from time to time. And I'm not saying that was not possible before, but I feel it's getting more attention, and teachers usually, given what's happening, they try to show care. And this is I'll try to link this in my presentation to what we call care pedagogy. And of course, where all of us are learning new skills, it's really interesting how we're currently doing this. Looking back, if I want to share my own experience with learning new skills. Usually, our learning and teaching center on campus provides workshops on how to use technology in classes. And I attended 1 week actually of workshops on blended learning. And for the last 3 years, or probably 4 years, I was planning actually to offer a blended course, and I kept postponing it for some reason. I don't know why. I felt like I wasn't really comfortable or 100% confident that I can do it. But under pressure now, we're offering not only blended courses, we're offering completely online courses. So I think, again, this crisis actually has given us the chance to experiment with new tools and to learn new skills. And we're willing to take the risk, I would argue. I'm not only talking about teachers, but also I'm talking about students and other stakeholders in schools and universities. Well, let me start by giving a brief introduction about the importance of feedback. And the question that we might have now is why feedback is important for learners. If we look at the slide, there is, as shown on the slide, there is a growing attention to feedback research in instructional settings. And to me, I think this interest has been enhanced by the assessment for learning movement, where there is focus on using feedback for improving instruction, for informing both teaching and learning. I think this is a good sign, and that's why feedback now is somehow perceived as a critical element in learning. And if you look also, Hattie and Temperley argue that feedback is among the most critical influences on learning in classes. Feedback can serve different objectives or different functions in that context. One of them is raising awareness about specific language problems or weaknesses they might have, students might have, and also informing students about their current level, and to me, more importantly, guiding their future plans. If students need diagnostic instruction, they need remedial teaching, or they need to work more on a specific skill that they feel they're struggling with, this is what we can get from feedback. I thought it's a good idea also to kind of reflect on what we do in traditional teaching versus what we do in online teaching. Online education mostly privileges text-based communication. although it's kind of changing, but I feel like there is more emphasis on text-based communication. But if you look at face-to-face classes, I feel like face-to-face classes tend to favor informal discussion and kind of question and answer sessions, and probably body and facial expressions. With technology, with the developments in technology, we're bringing some of these features into online education, but I feel like it's more common in face-to-face communication. Again, the research has shown that there is more writing in online courses, and take some effort to get students to get students engaged on online classes. These are the kind of, I would say, the differences between what we have in traditional teaching versus what we have in online teaching. Okay. I want to also now talk about online feedback. I would call them online feedback contexts. Usually with online feedback, I would argue that there are 4 different types of I would say, online feedback strategies or settings, or in a specific class. By the way, can you see the slides? I don't. Can you see the slides for that slide or not?
On my screen here, I can only see the first page, your title.
Oh, sorry. Just a second. How to move the slide? It's the first time to use Webex, so it's just I'm a Zoom person, so.
I think you just have to click on it. Try clicking on it, as usually you.
Is it moving now?
No, it's not moving.
No.
And some participants, they asked in the YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay.
You see the screen now, right?
Yes. I think now we can see the.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm sorry. I thought I'm sharing my screen. I do apologize about that.
Okay.
So basically, as I was saying, there are 4 different types of context when it comes to online feedback. The first one is the online feedback we tend to give in face-to-face courses. And then the online feedback in face-to-face courses that are somehow web facilitated, what we call technology mediated somehow. And online feedback in blended courses, and online feedback in online courses. I think the first one is kind of the common structure we have in most of our classes. The online feedback in face-to-face courses that are somehow web facilitated, if you're talking about learning management systems and or LMS and the things that we do in online discussions, again, this is something that's common. Online feedback is in blended courses. I think this is getting more attention, and I feel in many universities now there is that movement towards blended courses for a number of reasons. For the sake of, simplicity, I'm not going to talk about why blended courses is a trend these days, but I see more universities moving in that direction. And the fourth one is online feedback in online courses, and this is what we're currently seeing with COVID-19. And I'll try to focus on online feedback in online courses, and also I'll talk many of the discussions I'll be having kind of relevant also with blended courses, or even with the second one where you're doing feedback in traditional classes, but through using that are web facilitated. I'll talk briefly about what the literature says about online feedback, and if you look at the slide, I did a brief review for the literature for all online feedback, and the results actually are not conclusive. There are some contradictory results when it comes to online feedback, whether it's effective, whether it's not effective. But some literature reported some improvement based on online feedback. But however, some other studies reported that online feedback tends to be more about form than discourse. So it's still at the superficial level. And also the literature referred to some of the challenges we encounter when it comes to online feedback, especially with things related to familiarity with technology, although it's a little bit old because now with the digital natives, things are relatively different. They have, I would argue that computer familiarity was a concern 10, 15 years ago. But if you're talking about the kids now in our schools, we call them digital natives, it's no longer an issue. But to me, the main concern that I have, and even I have with my kid and with myself as well, working on or using technology, is screen concentration. There is a lot of distraction when it comes to using technology, and I think this is one of the concerns we have as teachers and as parents when our kids use technology in general. So I feel like sometimes feedback is negatively affected by that feature. Okay. Now, let me talk about planning online feedback. And there are some questions that we need to consider when we're thinking about how to carry out online feedback, how to do online feedback in our classes. And I try to make the discussion a little bit generic. Although my main interest is in writing, but many of these questions are still relevant in with other skills. Well, the thing is, you need to start with, when you're planning an online feedback activity, what is the purpose of that activity? What are you trying to do here? And then the second question, and I think this is the most common question that teachers usually have in mind when they think about online feedback: which platform should I use? What type of feedback? Audio, written feedback? Then you have a question about whether students know the expectations or not. What kind of expectations you have in mind? So this is something you need to clarify to the students. You need, and I feel like if you give detailed instructions about what is required in that task, things would become, I would say, easier for students. The issue that I wrote in the previous slide about familiarity with technology, and in that context, not only familiarity with technology, it's also familiarity with the specific tool you're using. If it's an app, if it's an online tool, if it's whether students are familiar with the app or the tool, and whether they need training on how to use it. And I think this is an important issue. Last semester, I tried to use a specific tool, and I've been using it for almost like 5 years now, and I felt it was fantastic. It's an annotation tool for for reading assignments. And I use it with my students, and I was excited because it was the first time to use it with the students. Apparently, the students didn't like it, and most of the comments that I received from them after 1 week: is it possible to go back to traditional reading rather than using this tool? And I was kind of curious why this is happening, and the responses were like, it's not really, we're not familiar with that tool. It's not really friendly. It's not user friendly. So I ended up just not using it. So if you're using a specific app, a specific platform, you need to make sure that the students are okay with that tool, and they're familiar with that tool. And if they need some training on how to use it, that should be provided. Okay, let me talk briefly about some of the tools that I've been using, seen also when it comes to online feedback. One of them is annotations. If you're inserting comments, you're highlighting things. There are many tools that you can use for annotation. One of them I really like, and I use in most of my classes, and even for my advisees when I get giving comments for dissertation writers. Google Documents. I mean, I felt like Google Documents is really straightforward when it comes to annotation, and even with the second one, audio feedback, you can insert audio feedback in there. Whether you go for written feedback or audio feedback, it's an issue that depends on how extensive the feedback is, and your own preference as a teacher, and also the preference of the students, what exactly they prefer. Surprisingly, many students prefer written feedback. Why? Basically because it's more practical for them, more convenient. Audio feedback, sitting down and listening for 5-7 minutes, a little bit boring. And with written feedback, you can prioritize what you want to read. You can always go back and check. Of course, you can always go back and if you're using an audio file, it's not as convenient as written feedback. I've used built-in rubrics where you have specific descriptors there on the rubric, and you can show students the things that they're lacking, and you can have different score levels based on that rubric. And it's useful, but to me, one thing that teachers need to be careful about is to use the rubric for the sake of assigning a score. So for this presentation, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of assessment for learning. We're giving feedback in our context, in our classes, to improve learning. While the score or the grade is important, but I feel like, especially when it comes to that context, I think it should take a backseat, and we should prioritize feedback, qualitative feedback, that would help guide future plans for students, future plans for you as a teacher, and also can help bring in some positive changes and improvement in students' performance. Automated feedback. I mean, some people would argue that it's not that useful, but like usually my response is, it's better than nothing. And when you ask students to use automated feedback, there are some tools for that, of course. You have also to let them know about the limitations of automated feedback. And it works really well if you have large classes and students don't have to wait for a long time to get feedback. And even when they get feedback, it's not as detailed as expected. So I think automated feedback can provide some support. Peer feedback, and I'll talk later on about peer feedback and why it's important. I have a couple of slides, so I'm not going to continue talking about it now. But the general rule and tip that I want to give you: start with the tools that your institutions already has. Don't go and look for something that's not available, that's not free. I really like tools that are freely available, like the Google Documents and the tools provided in Google Classrooms and other tools provided by Google. I think they're fantastic, and they're user-friendly, and students like them and they use them. So you don't have to use a fancy tool, or you don't have to go and buy an expensive one. Just go with what you have, and go with what students are familiar with. I want to talk now about student-related issues, and I want to talk about, and I want to focus on this what we call student-centered approach to feedback. And well, we have what the question probably you have in mind: why student-centered approach now? And it's not a new thing, but it's something that we need. Why? Because what we're currently seeing, and with virtual schooling and social distancing, and with that pressure that families are going through now, with people losing their jobs, they cannot find food, and then the other psychological trauma that comes with with all these like domestic violence, and the instability you have and in different places, there is a lot of stress. So we need really to pay more attention to students' conditions for learning and well-being. And this is something that we have to acknowledge is under threat in many areas. And that's why as teachers, we need to pay attention to these issues. Sorry. Okay. The approach actually, or the model that I'm trying to highlight today is based on the work of Livinich, and also based on an article that I published this year with Gavin Brown. And the model actually includes a number of issues, things that we should consider when we're giving feedback to students. Number one is the nature of feedback. And then the second one is student-related issues. The third one is response to feedback. And the fourth one is the action taken to address the feedback given by the teacher or the peer or whoever is giving the feedback. Let me talk first about the nature of feedback. As I mentioned earlier, the main purpose of feedback in our classes should focus on improvement, oriented feedback. As a teacher, when you're giving feedback, you need to ask yourself, what type of changes, what type of positive changes I'd like to bring into that situation? What kind of problems I'm having and how to fix them? This is exactly what we need to focus on. And as I said earlier, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of learning-oriented, what we call learning-oriented feedback. This is very important. And the second one is the time of feedback. When exactly you're giving feedback? Is it immediate feedback? Is it delayed feedback? If it's immediate feedback, why you think this is important? If it's delayed feedback, why we should consider that option? And you know, sometimes students wait for feedback for such a long time, and it becomes a little bit frustrating for them. And that's why as teachers, especially when we're giving feedback online, and for some reason, students think feedback, the teacher has to respond right away. To me, well, that might be the case, but in some other cases, you don't have time, there is a lot of pressure, there is a lot of workload. So you need to have the social contract with your students where you're telling them, well, I'm going to give feedback, but I'm going to give it within a couple of days, within a couple of weeks. You need to let them know about your expectations and when you can give them feedback, because otherwise they might have different expectations, and that might result in a lot of frustration. And then you need to make sure that the feedback is accurate. Sometimes, when you're reading a lot of stuff, when you're doing a lot of writing for your students, you don't pay enough attention to what's written, and that might result in some inaccurate comments, or comments that are not relevant, or comments that are not adequate. So you need to make sure that the feedback you're giving is accurate. The feedback tone as well. And again, going back to emotions and stress and the pressure that students are currently going through, you need to pay attention to the feedback. I mean, even if you want to give, you don't like something in their writing samples, or you want to give them some instructions, you can somehow do some sort of sugarcoating rather than being bluntly negative. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, students really have enough on their plate, so you need to show some care and some empathy. Then level of details. Sometimes you need to be as detailed as possible. Sometimes you can. I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm preaching to the choir here about the type of codes you're using with feedback. So it could be very brief, could be detailed. That depends, of course, on what you want to do, and it depends on the expectations of the students and the nature of the task. So this is something you should think carefully about. And as I said, it's based on the purpose you have and the expectations of the students. Comprehensibility. The feedback should be comprehensible. And the good thing with online feedback, it's not about legibility, your handwriting. It's not. So in traditional feedback, probably handwriting is an issue. But I feel like with online feedback, the issue shifts more into probably ambiguity, not being detailed enough, not being clear enough. Sometimes spelling and grammatical mistakes. We do this all the time, basically because we don't tend to revise a lot when we type. That might end up with issues, comprehensibility issues. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, alignment with expectations. You need to understand the expectations of the students, what they have in mind, and that would help you as avoid any frustration on the part of the students, any confusion. And I think you have happy students. Okay, the second one, as I said, the student issues, and one of them is the personal characteristics of the students. Well, some students like written feedback. Some of the students might prefer audio feedback. Some students might prefer being straightforward as much as possible. Some students don't like this straightforward approach to feedback. So you need to understand the students and you need to understand their expectations, what they have in mind, what they prefer, and then the feedback should somehow be tailored in a way that fits in with the personal characteristics of the students. Then the second issue that we need to consider is the initial response to feedback. I'm sure many of us have had different experiences with the response to feedback. And I can talk about my personal experience with feedback as a student and as a researcher as well. If you think about doing research and getting feedback from reviewers, journal reviewers, whatever you're writing, whatever you're producing, whether it's oral or written, you have this emotional attachment to what you're producing. So if you have a writing sample, if you have a journal article, if you have an essay, it's more like your baby. So you feel like you don't like anyone to even come close to that your baby. And that's why when you get some comments that you don't like, the initial feedback is probably rejection, more like a state of denial. And that's why one of the issues we need to walk students through is how to respond to feedback. And I'm not talking about respond to how to take action. I mean, the emotional response to feedback. There are strategies recommended for doing this, correct? You need to tell them at the beginning, probably read the feedback at the beginning, just briefly read it, quickly read it, and then just leave it for a day, and then the next day and try to revisit the feedback. I feel like this strategy is helpful because the first impression about feedback sometimes is a little bit, kind of frustrating for students. Some of them are kind of state of denial. Some of them try to blame others for their issues. And probably the teacher hates me. The teacher, doesn't like what I'm writing all the time, and I feel like I want to drop this course. So these are the kind of negative feelings you try to walk students away from. And with online feedback, it's doable, and it's doable through teaching them how to, or training them on how to respond to feedback, emotionally respond to feedback, and how to deal with frustration, with pressure, and others, and how to develop strategies to address the issues raised in the feedback. And I think sometimes, and I'll talk about this later when I talk about peer feedback, this is an issue that is even more common when we talk about peer feedback, because you might find some justifications for your teacher why he or she is giving you some negative feedback, but sometimes you don't have the same justification for your peers, for your colleagues or friends or whoever the peer that is giving the feedback. And then the fourth issue that I want to talk about, the action taking based on this feedback. So you got the feedback. What's next? What do you need to do? If there is a relatively common comment given by the teacher about your organization, for your development of ideas, what kind of action you need to take as a student, and also the action taken on the part of the teacher. Well, as a teacher, I mean, it's not only your job to give the feedback and just move on. You know, if there is an issue, or there is a problem, or there is a weakness, it's kind of common among your students, you need to have some remedial teaching plans to address some of the concerns raised on that feedback. And on the part of the teacher, I think the initial response that we are talking about in the previous step somehow has a substantial effect on the action taken based on that feedback. Because if the student keeps rejecting the feedback, well, I don't expect any positive action taken to address the concerns raised on in that feedback. So these are some of the issues that the model provides for online feedback. But I want to touch on other issues that are important in online feedback in general and online classes. Well, number one, and I think this is related to the issues I talked about earlier when it comes to the pressure that we're experiencing as students, as families, as a community in general, as a society, with the different things we're going through on a daily basis with COVID-19. Show some care as a teacher. And really, I mean, the classes that I taught this semester, I think I taught the first 8 weeks face to face, and then until the end of the semester, I did this online. And I heard a lot of personal stories and things that I didn't know of my students during the online classes. And it's just basically because that crisis has given me some more insights onto, things you need to pay more attention to when it comes to the students, because at the end of the day, students are not machines. They're human beings. They have families. They have, they have feelings, and every one of us has a story to tell with what's going on these days. So I think this is important, and show some care when it comes to feedback. It's not only about just the mechanic process, some comments and moving on. It's the process of thinking about the students, how they can benefit from feedback, and what kind of emotional responses that feedback might trigger. If you pay attention to these issues, I think online feedback would be effective. Otherwise, it's going to be a series of frustrations and rejection and denial on the part of the learners. The second issue that I want to talk about when it comes to engagement with feedback, there is nothing more frustrating for a teacher than spending a substantial amount of time giving feedback to the students. And then when the second draft comes, or when the second assignment comes, you basically see nothing of what you referred to in the first draft, or in the first round of comments. Engagement with feedback is important. You need to make sure that the students get engaged with feedback.
Dr. Atta, the sound is not very clear.
It's for only that part. It has been the case
for a while, just for a while.
Yeah, I'm not
now
sure.
It's clear.
It is clear. Okay, because I'll try to just mic. Okay, so again, engagement with feedback. As I said, there is nothing more frustrating than giving comments and then looking at the second draft or the second round of reviews, and you feel like nothing has been done by the student. And you need to make sure that the students get engaged with feedback and take some action. And that, of course, depends on how you're giving the feedback, the tone of the feedback, the instructions you're giving to them about what's expected on their part while working on their second draft or their second assignment. So these are issues you need to pay attention to while giving feedback. And then with online feedback, I feel it's important, especially during these days. I keep referring to these days and the crisis we're going through. I mean, it's always good to have this sense of community in your class with your students. you feel like you're working as a group. You're here for each other. You're supporting each other, and the purpose of that class or the purpose of that feedback you're giving is for the benefit of the whole group. This is important, and again, I mean, this is important not only for online feedback or online teaching. That it's important for whatever instruction activity we're involved in. Resilience. I mean, each and every one of us has some ups and downs for feedback. Sometimes especially when it's detailed with I'm not saying it's negative, but it's the student would feel there is a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of improvement that should take place. That might result in some sort of frustration and demotivation. And one issue that you need to make sure that the students have is resilience. It's not an easy thing, but as a teacher, you have to be the motivator. You have to be the person reminding them that they can do it. It's not mission impossible. It's mission possible. And you might feel like this is something that we do all the time, and it's just business as usual. But especially with these days, these words really matter. I mean, and these words, I definitely would make a difference with the students. So don't forget that mission, your mission, as a motivator, as a person who would push students to their maximum ability to make sure that they're on the right track, and regardless of the hurdles, regardless of the challenges, eventually they will do it. And another thing that is with online teaching in general and online feedback, and I think this is a positive thing, responsibility for their own learning. Students with online feedback, with teaching online, sometimes like they miss that support that they have in face-to-face sessions. It's good also as a teacher, in addition to providing the support, in addition to being there for them, to make sure that they're autonomous, they can do things on their own, because basically you're not available for them 24/7. I mean, of course, this doesn't contradict with the things that we talked about earlier, because at the end of the day, we should not be babysitting the students. They're not kids anymore. And so while providing support, you want to make sure that the students are independent, they can do things on their own. And I think this is something that comes with online teaching in general. Confidence in using technology. As I mentioned earlier, with digital natives, technology is not an issue anymore. And when it comes to, not saying technology in general, probably computer literacy, I would say. But if you're using specific platforms, new tools, you gotta make sure that the students know how to use these tools. Otherwise, it will be a frustrating experience for them, and some of them might not be willing to use such tools. And I think the example that I gave earlier about the annotation tool I used in my class, I think it's a good one, because I ended up not using it. So you need to make sure that students have confidence in using technology and using the application on the platform briefly about peer feedback. Earlier I talked about this sense of community, and there is something I want to talk about here, which is kind of relevant in the context of feedback, is what we call collaborative learning. In collaborative learning, I mean, we get engaged in a number of social activities, critical thinking, information sharing, and I think that eventually would end up would result in understanding, deeper understanding and retention of learned materials. One of the issues you need to address, or you need to consider when giving peer feedback, or when asking students to get peer feedback, you need to make sure that the students understand the rules of peer feedback. You know, you need to make sure that, you know, peer feedback, the main purpose is to help your colleagues, not to be very critical. Not even if you have something that's negative, you need to sugarcoat it. You need to use some hedging. And another thing about peer feedback is really peer feedback helps students to reflect on their own learning and to probably, as I mentioned earlier, would help them, you know, achieve this deeper understanding of things. Because, you know, you cannot really give adequate peer feedback without understanding you're reading. Another thing that helps students with peer feedback is sharing assessment criteria. So if you're if students do giving peer feedback on a writing sample, so you need to share, if there is a scoring rubric, if there are some scoring criteria you're using, you need to share these criteria with the students. You need to discuss the criteria with them as well, because you're going to make sure that the students similarly understand these criteria. And as I mentioned, so training is helpful when it comes to feedback, and also training is helpful when it comes to feedback strategies. You know, so if the purpose is to give detailed feedback, let them know about this. If the purpose is to give them direct feedback, indirect feedback, focused feedback, the different types of strategies we're using in writing context, yeah, you need to make sure that the students understand these strategies. I have a couple of quotations actually from students, and I looked on Coursera, and I wanted to see how students actually responded to writing classes, and I picked a couple of comments about peer feedback. And so this is let's look at the first one from us. So peer feedback assessments in this kind of a course with more complexity are a little bit annoying. Someone reviewed my essay, option, 3 paragraphs and conclusion, saying stuff about my 5 body paragraphs, showing that she has not even understood what the body paragraph was. The same girl also noticed lots of punctuation mistakes in my essay, while others evaluated it as almost perfect. I know it is kind of complicated to teachers and mentors to review the essay, but this model is a bit frustrating. If you look at the second one, the peer review process is open to abuse, but don't let it prevent you from learning and being who you are. Education is about growing as a person. And I wanted to bring in some kind of negative comments about peer feedback to highlight some of the issues that students experience when they give feedback or when they receive peer feedback. Again, it's the issue of not understanding the materials, not understanding the scoring criteria, not understanding what is required. This is something we need to highlight as teachers. And again, let me revisit the issue that I talked about earlier when it comes to improvement. You know, qualitative feedback in such a context is more important. You know, students need to understand that their colleagues are not after the score. It's not about the score. And in many cases, I try to discourage students from assigning a score when it comes to peer feedback. Peer feedback is about giving your colleague something that can help them become better writers. And that's why stay away from scores, stay away from grading, stay away from being judgmental. So I think it's all, I'll move on. I think I have a couple of slides. Hang in there. So let me summarize what I mentioned in a couple of minutes, and when it comes to online feedback guidelines. As I mentioned earlier, feedback should be improvement oriented, should focus on you know, helping make learning happen. We should prioritize feedback focus. You know, that of course it depends on the learning outcomes, what exactly you're looking into. Sometimes, you know, if your focus is only on developing ideas, you know, give feedback on that issue. if you're focusing on grammar, organization, go give feedback on that one. If the learning outcome is to have this holistic perspective about writing, give this holistic perspective. So don't spend too much time, talking about different issues while the learning outcome focuses on a certain element. So you need to understand the learning outcomes you have. You need to understand the objective behind giving feedback in that session, and accordingly, the feedback should follow suit. And then it's always a good idea to refer students to external sources. Source, and this is the beauty of online feedback. Instead of explaining a lot about how they organize their ideas, refer them to external sources. If they have issues with grammar, refer them to external sources. And there are so many websites, available out there, and many of you know these famous websites that guide students on how to write adequately and correctly. So instead of spending too much time writing or getting feedback, I think it's always a good idea to refer students to some of these sources. And online sources now, as I said, it's just that has made things way easier for both learners and students. Conferencing is helpful. Even if you're not teaching, you're not doing live teaching, I think it's always a good idea to have office hours where you talk to students online. I mean, face-to-face online. This helps. If you want to clarify something, if you feel like there is some confusion, there is some misunderstanding, I think best thing to do is to just schedule a meeting, an online meeting with the student, and talk to her or him directly. That would save a lot of time. I mentioned earlier about automated scoring or automated feedback. Refer students to automated feedback websites. They're helpful. They're not perfect, but they can provide some feedback. Sometimes they provide some diagnostic, information that can help you as a teacher, and also can help students. And I think the issue that we need to pay attention to is we should be flexible. Online feedback, online teaching in general, it's a new thing for many of us, and there are many things that are not sure of, and we're still experimenting with many techniques. Some of them might work, some of them might not work. We have to understand this. We have to be patient, and at the same time, we have to be flexible. If there is something that's not working, just move on and look for something else. Or just if you get fixated on a specific issue while it's not effective, I think you're wasting your time. I think that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I will be more than happy to have to answer any questions you might have. Thank you. Again, thank you, Abbas, for your.
Thank you, Dr. Atta Gabriel, for the wonderful presentation on feedback. It was very comprehensive. In fact, both the presentations were very comprehensive. We have about a few questions here. Number one is what the writer says here. Assessment using rubrics or framework measure the learning objectives, especially on higher order thinking skills questions. Is there any better yardstick coaches / teachers / assessors can deploy? I think what the person is trying to say is, how do we measure higher order thinking skills? Questions on higher order thinking skills in a better way. The person did not specify whether, I do not know he or she is referring to reading comprehension or writing. The skill was not specified, but what I can understand is higher order thinking skills. How do we assess or measure higher order thinking skills? Yeah. So I don't know which speaker would like to answer this question. And I'm not sure you have understood the question or not.
Probably I can talk about the context of writing and let Wahid talk about the context of reading, since the two presentations are of reading and writing. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, my microphone was off. I was speaking and yeah. Atta, you want to give it a try first? Go ahead.
Okay, of course. I mean, it depends on, if we're talking about higher order skills, it depends on the learning outcomes you have in your class, and it depends also on the level of the students. And if you're talking, let's talk about a university context, and you're talking about academic writing class. One of the issues we're having that's kind of relatively straightforward is basic writing skills. We'll talk about organization. We'll talk about development of ideas, etc. But then you can take it to the next level, and you look into argumentation, you look into discourse synthesis, you look into other issues, other kind of sophisticated issues, and you're doing this in loops. So probably you start with basic skills, and then you go to more sophisticated areas, and then you go back. So it's more like a recursive process. One of the issues I'm having sometimes with some arguments when it comes to higher order skills, and let me give an example from source-based writing, since this is an area that I work in. And sometimes people say, well, discourse synthesis as a skill is kind of very difficult, and we should not be introducing this until we kind of were done with basic writing skills. To me, I don't like this argument. I don't think it's a healthy argument for our community, the academic community. Why? Because we're producing students who are doing just fine with basic skills. But when it comes to writing in an academic context, or writing with an academic voice, this is an issue that we're struggling with, and we're paying a price actually in a university context for neglecting these skills, even in high school. You have a student coming to campus, and is spending and investing a lot of time and resources walking them through how to express their academic voice, how to write in a manner that would help them eventually join the academic club, if I may say that way. We're paying the price basically because as I said earlier, we're neglecting these skills at an earlier stage.
Yeah, thank you, Atta. If I also want to just add a few words here to what Atta said. I think the person who has asked the question is probably referring to Bloom's taxonomy, if I'm not wrong, because we use that as well, like higher order, lower order sort of thinking skill. As Atta said, yes, higher skills like analyze, like the act of creation of new ideas, creativity, analytical thinking, and all those. I think the jury is out on that. I should say there is no clear-cut answer for that, but depends on the context. In reading comprehension, I personally prefer, and that's what the theoretical framework that I've chosen for the instrument that we developed, to engage students in analytical thinking. So I wouldn't like just to go about and ask questions about what did someone say, what did the other person reply, and what did that person do, and things like that. They're actually facts, so the students can read the text easily and pick up the facts. But to engage students in those kind of higher order thinking skills, it would be important to ask questions that, for example, engages students to understand the attitude of the speaker or the main ideas, or to draw an inference based on the facts that they can read, but the facts that are only implicitly rather than explicitly stated. So yeah, those factors I would take into consideration in developing a test that engages students in higher level thinking.
Okay, thank you for the answers. There is another question. If we extract a reading text from a source or reading test, can the content of the original reading text be edited or added with our own paragraph in order to be able to churn out more questions? Was that clear, or you want me to repeat?
I think it was clear.
Okay, thanks.
It was about reading, right?
Yes. It was
Okay.
about, I think the person is talking about adapting and adopting sources for reading comprehension. And
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Very good question. Actually, in our the project that I presented, I had to truncate some texts. We did truncate some text, and in some cases we had to add a two-liner or one-liner at the start of the text, but we didn't try to doctor the text too much because the authenticity of the text would be compromised there. Remember that the assessment, one of the important features of the assessment is its authenticity, which is defined as the correspondence between the assessment with the real world situation. If we try to doctor the text too much and change the original ideas that were presented by a person who's, for example, a proficient writer, for example, to make the text simpler, a lot simpler than it is, etc. I think we will not be really doing a service to students here, because we will be engaging them in reading something that's not natural and has not been arguably not authentically reproduced. I'm not a big fan of changing the text too much. So if you think that the text that you have chosen is not suitable for your students, I think what we should do, and that's what I always do, is to basically put aside that text and replace it with something that fits into the context that I'm teaching. I prefer this approach to an approach where we make significant changes to the original text.
Okay, thank you for the response. We have one last question. I think this question is meant for Dr. Atta. Students are not familiar with peer feedback, and most of the time they will end up giving playful feedback to their friends. How do teachers tackle this issue?
I think this is an excellent question. Peer feedback is challenging, and one of the issues that I feel like even might add to that problem is the fact that teachers don't pay enough attention to training students on how to use peer feedback. And of course, there are some cultural issues as well. I mean, but you need, when in training, you need to focus on these issues. Well, you need to give them the sense of community. You need to make sure that that they understand that the purpose of peer feedback is not really to be critical, is not to be negative, is not to kind of take revenge, because like sometimes students come back at each other once they receive negative comments from a colleague. And again, I mean, you need to share with them the criteria. The problem with peer feedback sometimes it's not useful, basically because the students actually are left to give whatever feedback they have in mind. It shouldn't work that way. The peer feedback activity should start with a specific objective, should have a specific focus, and at the same time there should be, I'm not going to call them scoring criteria, but I like the word assessment because it gets into the issue of the qualitative information we get from peer feedback. So you need to make sure that you share the assessment criteria with the students. Even you can reward students for the type of comments that they're giving. So you can somehow showcase some of the good comments, and then you give them some sample comments. It doesn't have to be something from those students. Can get some comments that you don't like, comments that are extremely negative, and then you work together on how to make them more into the positive side. It takes some time, and the thing is, even if you do it for the first time and it's not, the results are not encouraging, it doesn't mean that we should not be using them. Try to take some notes and try to see what's going on with the activity and try to learn from the mistakes, and we build on this. And the main issue to me is to make sure that you have this positive, improvement-oriented perspective about how and why peer feedback is done.
That's an excellent response, Dr. Atta. Okay, so those were the questions asked by the participants. Thank you very much for the responses provided. Before we end this webinar, I would like to thank a few individuals. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Salasia Chetlah, the Dean of School of Languages, Literacies and Translation, University Science Malaysia, for allowing this webinar to take place. I also would like to thank Professor Abdul Qadir alias, who has been actually encouraging all the academic staff to create and share content online, including academic discussions like this. Another person is Mr. Chua Kiman. As you know, we had a technical glitch at the beginning of this event. It was him who came to my defense to help me settle or fix technical glitch. So it is now fixed. So that's all for today for this webinar. Are there any final remarks from the speakers, Dr. Atta, Dr. Wahid, before we end this webinar?
No, I just wanted to thank you again. It was really nice, and I hope we can do this again in the future.
Yes, hopefully we can do this. This is the first one, so yeah, we have more coming in the future.
Sure.
I second Wahid, and I'd like to thank you, Ala, for organizing that webinar, and I'd like to thank all the participants for sticking around and listening to our presentations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wahid, Dr. Atta. Okay, thank you everyone. So
thank you.
Till we meet again. Bye.
Sure. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.